This is Channel 4 as we begin an acclaimed series re-examining the causes and tracing the development of the Falklands War.
BBC World Service, the news, read by Lawrence Reeve Jones. Britain has told the United Nations it has evidence that Argentina is about to launch an invasion of the Falkland Islands.
At 3:30 p.m. local Stanley time, I was sitting here in my office at this desk, and a telegram came in from the Foreign Office. It was couched in the normal diplomatic language, and it's engraved on my heart. It read, "We have apparently reliable evidence that an Argentine task force will assemble off Cape Pembroke," that's just to the east of Stanley, "early tomorrow morning, 2nd April. Stop. You will wish to make your dispositions accordingly. Stop." That's all I had. And my communicator, Brian Wells, remarked as he brought it in, said, "Well, said, they might have said goodbye in the best of British."
La fuerza de desembarco estaba integrada por efectivos del Batallón de Infantería de Marina número 2, de la compañía...
En cada argentino, la idea de la recuperación de Malvinas arranca desde la escuela primaria. No solo la cuestión Malvinas está en nuestros cerebros, sino también está en nuestros corazones. Para esos hombres que se enteraron en ese momento que iban a ir a Malvinas, a recuperar las Islas Malvinas, fue una emoción muy grande. Yo he visto hombres grandes, hombres con grandes bigotes, pero con grandes lágrimas en ese momento.
Los comandos anfibios toman el cuartel británico que había sido evacuado horas antes por sus tropas.
And the first report we had of the enemy was from a solitary Marine Berry, whom we'd posted up to the top of Sapper Hill, just behind Government House. And quite naturally, a rather sort of panicky voice came over the radio, and Marine Berry said, "There are upwards of 150 hostiles each side of me. What shall I do?" Whereupon Major Norman gave good practical Marine advice, and he said, "Keep your ruddy head down."
And this first attack seemed very ferocious. It seemed to go on for a long, long time. There was a lot of firing. You may have been a Royal Marine Commando for 18 years, whatever it was I had been, but when it came to the other push, you just a little bit of a coward, because I remember thinking, God, if I get shot, and two things. One, I hope it doesn't hurt, and B, I hope I'm not going to make a fool of myself and I can go with some sort of dignity. I'm not going to lay here yelling and crying out. And I think everybody was slightly worried about that.
In the middle of all this, there was a little lull, and a very eerie, loud hailer voice came over. It's a Spanish, thick Spanish accent, which I can't possibly mimic. But what he said was, "Mr. Hunt, you are a reasonable man. Come out and surrender." Whereupon one of our Royal Marines gave a typical lower deck reply, which I couldn't repeat over the media. And whether our Argentine friend understood or not, I don't know, but he certainly got the message, because the loud hailing stopped and the firing intensified.
Rex Hunt, quite correctly, although it was comical at the time, and still makes me smile, was sitting under this large 6-foot table, large oak 6-foot table, and probably the safest place to be. And why not, for goodness sake? There's nothing he could contribute to the battle. We needed his negotiating brain and powers at a later point.
I said to Mike, "What have they got, Mike?" And he said, 30mm cannon, which is far heavier than anything we had. And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, it means they can knock the stuffing out of us, and we can't do a thing about it."
El gobernador Rex Hunt se rinde al comandante de las fuerzas de desembarco y así, tras 149 años de ocupación británica...
You had these two differing characters still in the scene. I mean, this tall, elegant man in battle fatigues and Sir Rex Hunt. Sir Rex Hunt couldn't be described as a big man. I suppose he must be about 5'6", and he was in a pinstripe suit, and he'd brushed himself down and in his brogues, and he pulled himself to his full height and squared his shoulders and looked at this tall man and said, before Busser could offer his hand or say anything else, he said, "This is British territory. We don't want you here. You're not invited, and I want you to go and take all your men with you."
Le dije que nuestro gobierno consideraba que el intruso era él, que yo venía a desalojarlo. Le pedí que se rindiera. No pareció muy dispuesto. Insistí, le hice presente que ya nos habían causado bajas, que no tenían posibilidad. Realmente en ese momento ya no tenían posibilidad de nada.
On April the 2nd, 1982, the people of Argentina celebrated the reconquest of the Malvinas, a divided nation united in support of the aggressive action taken by the country's military dictatorship. Barely 2 months later, the Argentine forces in the Falklands surrendered the islands to the British and returned defeated and humiliated to the South American mainland. The Argentine army was no match for the British. The majority of its troops were conscripts, poorly equipped and badly led. Its leaders made no effort to defend the islands against a professional force from the developed world. The Falklands War was seen as a triumph for Mrs. Thatcher and the professionalism of the British armed forces. The Conservative Party, under her leadership, won a landslide victory at the general election which followed. The victory was put down to the Falklands factor. Ten years after the Falklands War, it is possible to tell a different story. That nearly 1,000 men died in an unnecessary war. That the risks were so high that many senior British commanders opposed the action from the start. That luck, rather than military skill, prevented a British disaster. That the British campaign was marred by rivalry and poor planning. And, above all, it was a war which should never have happened.
I am sorry to say this because men's lives were lost and families were bereaved, but I firmly believe that this was an unnecessary war, a war that need not have been fought, in which men's lives on both sides need not have been lost if the government had taken proper precautions.
Britain had been aware of Argentina's aggressive intentions for 40 years before the invasion. In 1942, the pro-Hitler regime in Buenos Aires planned a military solution to the problem of the Malvinas. But the British government warned Argentina against the use of force. If necessary, we must call the Americans in, wrote one of Churchill's cabinet, but we must bar the Argentines. In the face of a determined British response, Argentina backed down. But the belief in the justice of Argentina's claim persisted as strongly as ever over the years that followed.
To me, it is still a mystery why the British are attached to these islands. They have no meaning for them, that are just in front of the Argentine coast, in the middle of the South Atlantic, near everything that is more or less an area of Argentine influence, and 9,000 miles from London, from Britain, from everything. Britain has nothing to do there.
Many in London agreed. But it was the islanders, and not the British government, who were determined that the Falklands remain British. The islanders were mainly sheep farmers, and most were dependent on the Falkland Islands Company for employment and housing. By the 1960s, the economy, dependent on wool, was weak, and the population was diminishing. As Britain's empire declined and her armed forces withdrew from the four corners of the world, the Falkland Islands, thousands of miles from the United Kingdom, but only 300 miles from Argentina, became an increasingly embarrassing and unwanted liability. The military warned that the defense of the Falklands would be almost impossible. Defense and foreign policy now all pointed to one thing: getting rid of the islands. A junior minister, Lord Chalfont, was given the job.
The view was that the Falkland Islands was a kind of hangover from the imperial days, that there was no really intelligent reason why it should remain in the position it was at that moment, and that indeed there were very strong reasons why one should begin talking to the Argentinians about a change of status, because it was pointed out that it was close to Argentina. It was a long, long way away from the United Kingdom, that there were all sorts of geographical and other reasons why we should contemplate a change in the status quo. And this, it was towards that end that the Foreign Office thinking was at that moment directed.
Lord Chalfont was sent to the Falklands to discuss the idea of a transfer of sovereignty.
My reception when I arrived in Port Stanley was, shall I say, less than enthusiastic. They said, we are British citizens, we want to remain British citizens, we are not interested in any ideas you have about closer links with Argentina, please go away. It was as simple as that.
The Foreign Office got hold of the idea, I don't know when, that giving the Falklands to Argentina was a small price to pay for better relations with not only Argentina, but with Latin America. That's all right if they could have persuaded the Falkland Islanders that their destiny lay rather with the Argentine than with the United Kingdom and what remained of the empire. The Falkland Islanders were not impressed. They were not of Spanish or Italian origin. They spoke English. They had sent their sons to fight in 2 world wars on our side. They were a small, loyal, decent community, and they were entitled to the protection which only a British Parliament could give them.
The annual reception of the Falkland Islands Association in Lincoln's Inn in London. The lobby group was formed in 1968 to protect the islanders from an unwanted transfer to Argentina.
It was a very powerful lobby, disproportionately powerful for its size and for the size of the Falkland Islands. By the time I got back, that lobby was beginning to have its effect in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and it was made clear to us over the whole spectrum of political opinion that we were doing something which was not acceptable to Parliament. I wrote a report for the Cabinet in which I said, unless this problem is solved, we will sooner or later have a war with Argentina. And of course, in due course, that came to be true.
An unstoppable coalition from both sides of the House of Commons joined forces and killed any hope of a deal with Argentina. In 1976, a military dictatorship seized power in Argentina. The new junta took a much more aggressive line on the question of the Malvinas. Senior officers saw the campaign for the return of the islands as a useful way of uniting public opinion behind an unpopular regime. The Argentine Navy, in particular, was determined to end the national humiliation of a permanent British presence in the waters of the South Atlantic. In the autumn of 1976, senior officers in the Argentine Navy drew up plans for a full-scale assault on the Falkland Islands using all the available ships, as well as a force of Marines. The mastermind behind the plans was Admiral Jorge Anaja. Anaja and his nationalist colleagues in the Navy were nicknamed the Guerrillas because of their hardline approach to the Malvinas question. Since his return from a spell in London as naval attaché, Admiral Anaja had spent much time planning the capture of the Malvinas.
El comandante de la flota de mar en ese momento, almirante Anaya, tenía, me explicó, una idea de presentar a la superioridad y al gobierno militar recientemente instalado la idea de hacer un golpe de mano en Malvinas para solucionar el problema que volvió.
As planning continued for the invasion, Anaja ordered his navy to be more aggressive in the waters around the Falklands. Fishing boats were fired on. A British survey ship was attacked. James Callaghan had just succeeded Harold Wilson as Prime Minister.
The big issues in the world are like a huge liner. It takes a long time to change course. They move very, very slowly. It's the small issues, relatively small in numerical terms, the pimples on the map, the Hong Kongs, Belize, Gibraltar, Falklands. It's those issues which I always found moved quickly and caused a lot of trouble unless you kept a constant eye on them.
In November 1976, talks were due to take place in Buenos Aires over the Malvinas. The British Embassy in Buenos Aires warned the Prime Minister that if the negotiations failed to satisfy Argentina, military action was likely.
So I called a meeting of the Defence and Overseas Policy Committee, and I said, look here, let us send a small force. I'm a great believer in sea power and the value of sea power. I have described elsewhere how ships can advance and retreat without creating anything like the tension that an army does if it moves, because they traverse the open expanse of the sea and you are in a position to move forward or back as the situation demands. And I said, let's send a couple of ships, 2 or 3 ships there.
I was the fleet commander at the time, and I've always regarded it as one of the best kept secrets ever. The Falkland situation had blown hot again, and the decision was taken in Whitehall to deploy clandestinely a nuclear submarine and separately, but at the same order of time, 2 frigates and a supporting fleet tanker, and this was done. It did mean that at any point that the politicians desired, they could say to Argentina, we have got in position, whatever it was, now stop it or else.
This force stood 1,000 miles off Argentina. I have some reason to believe that they did know, and I was quite happy of them to find out. But as far as I was concerned, the cover would have been, oh, these are normal naval exercises. They're traversing the ocean as they're entitled to do in the South Atlantic, of course.
The Prime Minister ordered the head of MI6, Sir Maurice Oldfield, to let the Argentine military know of the presence of a British submarine close to the Falklands. Admiral Anaja's invasion plan was thwarted. The military junta, aware of the British presence, rejected the Admiral's proposals out of hand.
Wherever the white ensign is hoisted and wherever the white ensign appears, that is a token of Britain's determination and, I trust, capacity to defend what is necessary. The Argentine Navy understood that. They had long relationships with the British Navy. And so I had no particular problems in that sense, provided they knew we were ready to defend them by force. If necessary, I was convinced they would never attack.
Don't New Kleenex quilted toilet tissue is specially quilted to give it cushion softness and super absorbency.
Nicky.
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a copy of the Daily Mail.
Starting tomorrow in the Daily Mail Dream Cottage game, we're giving away this idyllic country home deep in the heart of Wordsworth's Lake District. Plus, there's hundreds of thousands of pounds in cash prizes to be won, as well as the chance to win one of many fabulous new family cars, or one of dozens of once-in-a-lifetime holidays. Just pick up a game card from your newsagent and play the Dream Cottage game starting tomorrow only in the Daily Mail.
Could I have a throw of Eichel?
Put it past him. Did you see Charles at the weekend? Flip.
Yes. Played 18 holes at Wood Park. Swab, please.
Ah, this looks more complicated than we thought.
Yes. I think we're going to be seeing rather a lot of this chap.
I hope he's got an understanding boss. Did you win?
Yes. It's close until the 30th.
There may be trouble ahead, but while there's moonlight and music and love and romance, let's face the music and dance. Let's face the music and dance.
How's he doing?
He's comfortable.
You needn't worry if your life changes. Allied Dunbar financial plans adapt to help you cope with the unexpected. Allied Dunbar, for the life you don't yet know.
Now, I made some dosh from Nick the Greek with a load of dodgy plates. And I'll make some more with liquid gold, because they've such high interest rates.
A huge crowd and a huge cheer. Plainclothes police out of a car behind her. And Mrs. Thatcher out.
2 years later, Margaret Thatcher came to power. The Falklands were not high on her list of priorities.
A wave that we've now become really quite well accustomed to throughout this campaign.
She appointed Lord Carrington as her Foreign Secretary.
Almost immediately after I became Foreign Secretary, I went into this very carefully. And it was quite clear that it was impossible to go on doing absolutely nothing. I mean, the impatience of the Argentines was running out, and I think it was necessary to take make some kind of movement, and there were some difficult decisions to take when you did that.
Carrington convinced Mrs. Thatcher that the only solution was to hand sovereignty of the islands to Argentina. The idea was that Britain would then lease the Falklands back for a long period. It was hoped that in 70 years or so, the islanders would no longer care about their status. But the inhabitants of the Falklands did not welcome the idea of their children, or even their children's children, becoming Argentinians.
The mere word lease back, by then people were getting very suspicious of what the Foreign Office were up to. And I think there was just a great reaction against that word. And nobody even bothered to ask what the terms might be, what the length of time. They just threw it out.
The mothers of the disappeared march in protest at the loss of their children. At the same time as the British government proposed lease back to the Falkland Islanders, Argentina was going through a period of intense repression. Thousands of young men and women were abducted by the junta. Few were ever seen again by their mothers. As many as 20,000 are thought to have been killed by the right-wing military regime.
Priests were abducted for protesting against this violation of human rights. Found their bodies found on the roadside a day or two later with their eyes gouged out. And when the local bishop objected to it, he too was run off the road in his car, left to die by the roadside. Former Argentinian diplomats who raised their voices were killed. University professors, teachers were killed. Students who protested were killed. Argentina became a graveyard. Now, can you imagine anybody with any spirit at all in this country having fought against the Nazis? Can you imagine that we would agree to the handing over of the Falkland Islanders to a regime of that kind? from that moment on, there was no point in carrying on any kind of negotiations.
Well, of course, that's nonsense, and really, if he thinks about it, Sir Bernard Blaine knows it's nonsense. The trouble is that so many people think that the Foreign Office, because it deals with foreigners, which is its business, is necessarily on the foreigners' side. The business of the Foreign Office is to get the best bargain it can for Britain without going to war. And on the whole, it does it extremely well. But to suggest because it's talking to foreigners, some people seem to think because you talk to foreigners you're disloyal, that it's against British interests is really, I mean, it's pretty childish.
Once more, the House of Commons came to the rescue of the Falkland Islanders. A coalition of left and right joined to end any idea of transfer of sovereignty to Argentina.
The reaction was with utmost ferocity from all quarters of the House against it, from the Conservative Party, from the Liberal Party, from the Labour Party. There was unanimity. The position was quite clear. Leaseback was dead. The Argentinians had a very clear claim on the Falklands, which they were going to persist with. We were prisoners of our circumstances. The only thing we could do in those circumstances was to keep the talks going in some way, in the hope that something might emerge.
The junta in Buenos Aires were furious when they heard that Leaseback was dead. There seemed no hope that the islands would ever return to Argentina without the use of force.
Frustration was developing within the armed forces mostly. Any sort of attitude in the public in general saying, well, all these talks is only, they're pulling our leg. They thought they were being fooled by the British diplomacy into a sort of an endless, useless negotiations.
As its frustration over the Malvinas grew, Argentina built up its armed forces. Despite the junta's appalling record on human rights, France and Britain were eager to sell. The French supplied super-étendard fighters with Exocet missiles. Britain gave the Air Force bombs and sold the Navy 2 of its most modern destroyers. Ironically, just when Argentina was rearming, Britain disarmed. In June 1981, John Nott, the Defense Secretary, announced the slashing of the Navy's surface fleet. 2 carriers, he said, would be sold. The amphibious assault ships would be taken out of service. Nearly 1/3 of the surface fleet would go.
When I became Defence Secretary, I was horrified to find that the defence programme was some £6,000 million overextended. And we had to make immediate cuts in the programme as soon as I became Defence Secretary so that we could pay our bills to contractors and others. It was a disgraceful situation that had arisen.
The cuts infuriated the Royal Navy, who, unsurprisingly, thought them crass, ill thought out, and dangerous. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, pitted himself against John Nott. Leach, an admiral of the old school, firmly believed that the interests of the Royal Navy and the country were indivisible. He was convinced that the proposed cuts were immoral and would damage Britain. He felt that John Nott had no understanding of the issues at stake.
I personally despised his performance as Defence Secretary. I have nothing against him as a chap. In fact, we got on quite well together on matters not to do with our professional work. But he was inclined, in fact, he wouldn't listen, didn't listen. He came in with preconceived ideas. And frankly, I think he made a howling cock of the Defence Review.
John Nott announced that the Defence Review was designed to rid the Navy of its task force mentality. Henceforth, he said, the Navy was to be confined to the waters of the North Atlantic.
We were at that time really deeply concerned, as was the whole of NATO, with the Soviet threat. I mean, we're not a rich country. All our resources necessarily were deployed in facing the main threat to our own islands, our home, where we live, the British Isles, and the Falkland Islands had to be an extremely peripheral issue. Indeed, it was a non-issue.
Of course, what he failed to see, to remember, was that we still did have places of sovereign territory with British citizens, and the Falklands was a classic example, and as such, being British citizens, they were entitled to British law and British defense.
As part of the review, John Knott said that the ice patrol ship HMS Endurance would also be scrapped. Endurance was Britain's only naval presence in the South Atlantic and acted as the Falkland Islands guard ship.
Endurance was falling apart. It was going to cost a great deal of money to refit, and therefore, when I asked the Royal Navy for what they themselves would like to give up, they had, I think, HMS Endurance at the top of their list. I didn't think it was worth fighting for the future of Endurance against another frigate, and I didn't regard it as a serious defense asset, and nor did the Royal Navy. So we jointly actually took the view that in the list of priorities, Endurance should be scrapped.
I condemned them at the time and said they were wrong. I said they would give the wrong signals to the Argentine government, and they did. And there is, I believe, intelligence information which has become public, which said that those indications gave the Argentines the inevitable belief that Britain was withdrawing. You've got to do it in an orderly way, and in a way that you do not expose to the Falkland Islands as they were exposed by our failure to protect them properly.
The signal that Britain was withdrawing Endurance was received loud and clear in Argentina.
So that gave us an idea that Britain was less and less interested in the island. At the same time, we had the impression that British government had no interest at all in reaching an agreement, that Britain was stalling.
In London, the Foreign Office became alarmed. Diplomatic policy and defense policy were hopelessly out of step. The Foreign Secretary was well aware that the withdrawal of Endurance would give the wrong impression. He wrote to John Knott 3 times to ask him to reconsider.
He felt unable to change his decision, but I tried on a number of occasions because I thought, I don't think the Endurance in itself was very important. I mean, it was the signal that the Endurance, our intention to withdraw the Endurance that was important.
In December 1981, General Leopoldo Galtieri became president of Argentina and leader of the military junta.
Personal militar y civil del Comando en Jefe de la Armada, buenos días.
Galtieri relied on the support of the Navy and his fellow junta member Admiral Anaja for his position. Anaja had agreed to support Galtieri on one condition, that he approved the Admiral's plan for an invasion of the Malvinas. Immediately the new junta took power, Anaja ordered his most senior officers to start planning.
Mis relaciones con el almirante Anaya no eran de amistad. Yo nunca fui amigo del almirante Anaya, no tenía confianza con él. Fue a Puerto Grano, además él es un hombre retraído y yo básicamente también, así que no somos expansivos, no somos de tener muchos amigos. Ahí me dice, para mí en forma totalmente sorpresiva, que tengo que preparar un plan para capturar las Malvinas.
Admiral Lombardo joined a top-secret committee made up of the junta itself and senior officers of the 3 services. Planning started in January 1982.
La orden que recibimos nosotros fue realizar un plan para una ocupación en caso de que fracasaran las negociaciones diplomáticas que quería iniciar el gobierno argentino. Comenzamos a hacer la planificación, como le he dicho, con muy pocos oficiales. Ello hacía que la planificación fuera lenta. Queríamos hacerlo en un marco de gran discreción para que nada trascendiera. La base de nuestro enfoque de planificación era lograr una acción por sorpresa.
Si los ingleses, los británicos se enteraban con tiempo, podían hacer 2 cosas que para nosotros iban a ser fundamentalmente difíciles de superar. Una era el refuerzo importante de la guarnición en Malvinas y otra era la aparición en el Atlántico Sur de una fuerza naval considerable. sobre todo si estaba integrada por submarinos que nosotros no teníamos capacidad de responder.
In the cafes and bars of Buenos Aires, the news that the junta was contemplating military action soon became common knowledge. The city is alive with gossip, and nothing is secret for long. The threat of the invasion, it was hoped, might push the British to a solution. As the invasion was planned, diplomatic pressure was increased. Soon stories were appearing regularly in the Buenos Aires press. The newspapers warned the British of the dire consequences of a failure to reach an agreement with Argentina. The leading nationalist paper, La Prensa, published 3 articles stating that military action was likely if nothing came of negotiations.
The press was the big factor, increasingly hawkish in its output. In La Prensa and all the other newspapers, and it was on the television, and people were talking about it. And this was, I think, a little unusual. Even amongst the English in Buenos Aires, the old established English who'd been there a long time, these were people who had always just accepted that the problem was there, but suddenly you know, they were worried, and they were worried, we were worried.
The large and wealthy British community in Argentina took the warnings very seriously. Their newspaper, the Buenos Aires Herald, said that Britain should either defend the islands or hand them over gracefully. To do nothing was the worst option.
The Falklands, in my view, was a ripe plum waiting to fall into the hands of any professional military machine, which, like the Argentine armed forces, would have wished to have occupied them.
Colonel Love had watched many Argentine military exercises. He knew that the special forces were practiced in the art of a rapid action to take a lightly defended objective. It was called a coup de main. The military had used this tactic many times during government takeovers. Love put 2 and 2 together. He was aware that the Argentine armed forces were increasingly angry with Britain over the Malvinas. He knew, too, that the Falklands were hardly defended. There was an obvious likelihood of an armed invasion. The military attaché wrote this all down in a report, which he sent to London.
It said that the coup de main operation was clearly a very easy option for the Argentine military to take. The governor could quite easily be put in the bag, that the small Royal Marine detachment could easily be overpowered, that there was nothing, really, which we could do about it.
Love's report, warning of an invasion, was greeted with indifference by the Ministry of Defence and with contempt by the Foreign Office. An official wrote, "It says nothing which we don't already know."
I had hoped that such a letter would have sparked a few questions. Do you really mean this? Aren't you overemphasizing it? Haven't we been here before? Isn't this all hype? But no, silence, complete silence.
There were other things going on at the same time, and you didn't concentrate entirely on the Falklands. I mean, we had, at that time, we had Rhodesia, for example, and the European community and the budget problems. And so, though one kept a very sharp eye on this, it wasn't in the priority in foreign affairs of government at that time.
I think that the government took its eye off the ball. That there was not that same continuous appreciation of the situation in these small areas that I made. Now, let me add, in self-defense, I'm very ready to admit my mistakes, and I made a lot of mistakes. But on this, I am certain that I was 100% right the whole time, and the government was wrong.
curtain comes down on the fallen empire of Charles Forsyth King. From a small investment firm, he built a dynasty that ruled Wall Street.
Rule Wall Street? I am Wall Street.
Times were good, but times change. What he thought was a bull market began to bear down on him.
King's mistake was in preferring paper money to paper itself. He should have invested in timber.
It seemed King's Midas touch had turned to pewter.
I kept telling him, Charlie, you hit a brick wall, buy bricks.
He worked us day and night. All that electricity. Too bad we didn't have our money in coal.
Where once stood a mighty Xanadu was now a ravaged financial ruin.
Well, it tells me that he failed, but not why. Hey, what were his last words?
They say it was one word, the one thing he wished he had.
Hansen.
Drugs? She hears something about drugs and goes berserk. She doesn't even listen, just works herself up.
What about that?
Treats me like a kid.
I mean,
Screaming and shouting,
when I'm
telling me
talking
what to do.
Don't answer me back. Who do you want it to...
I can make up my own mind. Anyway, my mates know more about it than she does.
If you don't talk to your child about drugs, someone else will. Phone 0800 555 777 for a parent's guide.
Can you think of a car rental company beginning with A that gives you a Vauxhall Corsa for just £28 a day? That's right, Alamo.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be landing shortly in London, where you can expect heavy showers, fluffy towels, and a powerful hairdryer.
Bottoms dropped out of pork belly futures, I see, Henry. I remember when career in the city was thoroughly respectable. Now it appears to be more like a passport to Clinton.
In troubled times, who do you trust with your investments? At Equitable Life, we pay no commission to middlemen, we have no shareholders, so you profit from our principles.
Didn't happen to back Mr. Whoopsie in the 230, did you, Henry?
With no shareholders and no commission to middlemen, it's an Equitable Life, Henry.
This month, buy any new Renault 19 and Renault UK will give you something special. £450 back. Tempting, isn't it?
The island of South Georgia, a dependency of the Falkland Islands, 600 miles south of Port Stanley. The island had once been a thriving whaling station, but was now deserted. On the 19th of March 1982, an Argentine force landed on the islands and triggered a series of events which was to lead to war. The group appeared to be scrap workers. They had a contract with the British company to remove disused whaling equipment. But many of the scrap workers looked like soldiers, and they had used Argentine Navy ships to land on the island. The British governor asked London for permission to remove them, with force if necessary.
All the indications were that we were losing interest in the Falkland Islands. That's why I reacted so strongly when they landed in South Georgia illegally, because I was convinced that had we not reacted firmly, we wouldn't have got the Argentines out of South Georgia again. They would have stayed.
London differed. At first, Endurance was ordered to remove the scrap workers from South Georgia, using force if necessary. But the Foreign Office later decided that such action would be too provocative. Endurance was ordered instead to proceed to South Georgia and wait for further orders. But it was too late. When the junta in Buenos Aires learned of Endurance's mission, it was seen as the first aggressive step in a British military reinforcement of the Falkland Islands. Admiral Anaja warned that Britain was likely to send a submarine south, as in 1977. His plans for an invasion could be thwarted once again. This time, however, he was not going to let the British stop him. He summoned Lombardo.
El 21 de marzo a mí se me pregunta, más que se me dice, ¿cuándo podemos estar listos para la operación? Me voy a Portugalano, hablo con mis comandantes subordinados, con el general García, con los brigadieres, etcétera, etcétera, y llegamos a la conclusión de que el 23 decimos que podíamos estar listos para zarpar el día 28.
When Mrs. Thatcher read Foreign Office reports of Argentina's increased hostility, she wrote in the margin of a briefing paper, "We must make contingency plans." But nothing was done. The Foreign Office had already rejected the option of sending a submarine, and the Ministry of Defence repeatedly advised against any reinforcement of the area. They told Mrs. Thatcher that the islands were indefensible, and if invaded by Argentina, could only be retaken by a large task force using ships which were about to be scrapped. The decision to scrap HMS Endurance was confirmed.
I don't think until the operation actually started that there was any serious belief either in the Ministry of Defence or anywhere else in Whitehall that an invasion would take place. I think there was increasing concern that there might be, a series of incidents. And what the Ministry of Defence did at that time was to look much more closely at, what could be done in terms of sending some ships, both surface and underwater, out, in that kind of direction.
As tension increased over South Georgia, the Ministry of Defence, without consulting the Foreign Office, decided to call Argentina's bluff. On March the 28th, the ministry leaked the news that a submarine was leaving Gibraltar and heading south to the Falklands. The submarine was, in fact, speeding back to base. The Ministry of Defence hoped that the Phantom submarine would deter Argentine action. It had the opposite effect. The Foreign Office was outraged.
To me, that was one of the most serious things that happened throughout the whole of that crisis. And I was deeply shocked. Indeed, my principal private secretary said to me when he heard that news, that the headline was coming out the next morning, late at night, he went out in the garden and was physically sick because we realized the damage that was going to do. I believe that that was a clear warning to the Argentinian, which they will have taken heed of, that if a nuclear submarine was coming down, it would take it, say, roughly 12 to 14 days to get there. That if they were going to do something, they had to do it very quickly.
When the junta heard the news, the order to proceed with the invasion was confirmed immediately. General Galtieri saw an opportunity for greatness slipping from his grasp. Admiral Anaja warned that landings would be impossible once the British submarine arrived. Brigadier Lamidoso, the moderate air chief, did not object. The operation, codenamed Rosary, was to be a religious crusade to restore Argentina's birthright.
Por supuesto, la tarea fue febril. Yo he tenido oficiales y suboficiales que estuvieron en los locales del Estado Mayor desde el día 24 hasta el día 28 sin ir a sus casas y yo diría sin ir a dormir. El hecho es que el día 28 a las 10 de la mañana estuvimos en condiciones de zarpar con todo el material a bordo, con todo estibado a bordo como debe ser en una operación anfibia, todo nuestro material funcionando, el personal bien equipado, sin problemas.
On the 28th of March 1982, the invasion force left port.
Estaban compuestas por el portaaviones 25 de Mayo con su aviación embarcada, los destructores Hércules, Santísima Trinidad, Pi, Bouchard, Seguí y Piedrabuena, las corbetas Drummond y Granville, el submarino Santa Fe, el buque de desembarco.
Late on the 31st of March, Whitehall received intelligence for the first time that Argentina was about to invade the undefended Falklands. Mrs. Thatcher was in her rooms in the House of Commons with John Nott, the Defence Secretary. He and his defence officials told her that there was little that could be done. Once captured by Argentina, the islands could only be retaken with extreme difficulty by a large task force.
I think no consideration had ever been previously given, as far as I know, to retaking the Falkland Islands after an Argentinian invasion. Therefore, there was no contingency plan to draw on to make sensible estimates. So that on the day that it all happened, the minister was being briefed in a very considerable hurry by the defence staff. And the defence staff would have had very little information, hard information, on which to work. You would expect, therefore, their advice to be cautious in the extreme.
I did say to her that I thought that it was an exceptionally difficult task and that the landing, an opposed landing on the Falkland Islands without proper air cover was going to prove a very difficult task indeed. Yes, I certainly was cautious about it at that stage.
Admiral Sir Henry Leach dashed from his office at the Ministry of Defence to the House of Commons. He was desperate to intervene. In his view, the future of the Navy and the country were at stake. He knew that John Nott and his officials were likely to be advising the Prime Minister against the sending of a task force.
I had an immediate and acute feeling, what the hell's the point in having a Navy if you're not going to use it? So I rushed along to get in on the act quickly. Got held up by the splendid policeman in the central lobby. In due course, the Defence Secretary was located with the Prime Minister, and I was asked to go in. She was undoubtedly seeking positive, factual data on which to make her own mind up as to whether this thing was on or not. And one of the more pertinent ones, they were all pertinent, but this is particularly pertinent and almost the final crunch, was could we do it against all the risks that we'd previously discussed? And I said, yes, we could, and in my judgment, we should, which was not my business, that was a political matter. And she was onto that like in a flash. Why do you say that? And I said, well, because I think if we don't, or if we do it half-heartedly, and are not completely successful, we should be living in a different country, which counts for very much less.
The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete.
Henry Leach's role was crucial, and it really has been insufficiently recognized. At that meeting, there had been no proper consideration in the Ministry of Defence about how this should be tackled. I think the Prime Minister was groping for some action that she could take which would impress on the Argentinians the British determination not to let them get away with this unprovoked aggression. And Henry Leach, as you know, arrived and said to the Prime Minister that he could have a task force ready with a brigade of Royal Marines by next Wednesday. And she seized on this as something that could be done.
Admiral Leach deserves the greatest credit for his performance at that meeting. It helped our self-confidence in a very difficult situation, and he deserves also the very greatest credit for the readiness of the fleet. It also has this great Nelsonian tradition for a sort of get up and get at 'em, sail at the enemy. And this is deeply ingrained. It's less cerebral than the other two services, but much more gung-ho, I would say.
John Nott's Navy cuts were dead in the water. The Royal Navy's future and the career of the Prime Minister now depended on the very ships which were meant to be scrapped. If Mrs. Thatcher was to remain in office, the Falklands would have to be recovered. As the task force sailed, the Foreign Secretary and his team of ministers accepted responsibility for the diplomatic disaster and resigned.
Well, my personal reaction was of, in a sense of humiliation, because, I mean, here we were in a situation in which the Argentinians had invaded and captured British territory, and we'd been unable to do anything about it. And in a way, rightly or wrongly, and the assessment that we'd made, the intelligence assessment, and the result of those intelligence assessments had caused this to happen.
I don't know that I could say that there was a major error of judgment. You see, we've heard similar sounds from many Argentine regimes, many times in the last year. Many, many times. And I suppose you could say we ought somehow to have known this one was different. We'd heard a lot of it before, but the fact is that the Argentines this time invaded. We were in charge when they invaded. And that's why Lord Carrington felt so strongly. Indeed, I think we all feel deeply about it.
What we blame the government for is that they didn't take sufficient precautions either to make their intentions known. Who could doubt that Mrs. Thatcher, whose whole political life is being conducted on the basis that whatever she is doing is a war, a battle, a fight, who could doubt that she would throw her weight on the side of recovering the Falklands? That was never made clear to the Argentine government. And instead of this being a great victory for the government, and I'd be fully ready to concede it if they'd done the right thing, it was a defeat for the government. What history will say, I don't know, but that's my own conclusion.
Failure. Do you remember what Queen Victoria once said? Failure. The possibilities do not exist. That is the way we must look at it. Use all our professionalism, all our flair, every single bit of native cunning, every single bit of professionalism, and all our equipment. And we must go out calmly, quietly, to succeed.
For more information about the history and geography of the Falklands War, send £1 for our viewer's guide. Cheques or postal orders are payable to Channel 4 to the Falklands War, P.O. Box 4000, London W36XJ. Next week, the series continues with a full account of the sinking of the battleship Belgrano, and that's at the same time, 10:55.
A night of danger, drama, and at 9, even deceit, as a man suffering from AIDS goes undercover in a search for an alternative cure. At 9:30, the lines are blurred in the final of Karachi Cops, as the good guys take their own retribution. Then, one stormy Monday.
It is time the tough got going.
The movie thriller with Melanie Griffiths, Sting, and Sean Bean. The suspense of Tuesday night on 4.
Next tonight on 4, it's not Paper Moon, though we're somewhere in the same direction. We're on the road in Wim Wenders' Alice of the Cities, sharing a journalist's quest to return a 9-year-old girl to her grandmother.
I'm a branch manager at Nationwide, and I'm really looking forward to being part of the commercial.
We've got to the day where it's going to happen, and all the camera and all the staff are here as well.
Mortgages, savings, investments, insurance, banking and pensions.
We're not actresses, and it's obvious that we're not actresses, and they can actually come into the branches and see us. It was really exciting, and it's nice to see the background of what actually happens behind the scenes and how much work really goes into that part of it. I was really shocked when I found out that my idea was chosen. Building a relationship with Nationwide.
That was great, Robert. You can come out now.
Thank you.
I'm Jo Wells, and this is my advert.
Mortgages.
Mortgages.
And savings.
Mortgages.
Savings. Investment. Mortgages. Savings. Insurance.
Mortgages, savings, investments, insurance.
Banking.
And community services.
Mortgages, savings, investments, insurance, banking and pensions.
Mortgages, savings, investments, insurance.
Banking, pensions, estate agents.
And business accounts.
Mortgages.
Savings.
Investment.
Insurance.
Banking.
Pension.
Estate agents.
Surveyors. Mortgages.
1 in 5 households in Britain is building a relationship with Nationwide.
Personal loans.
Don't forget mortgages.
The Building Society, Nationwide.